They say that in the darkest hour, the human spirit shines the brightest. It is not a fire that rages, but a single, stubborn flame that refuses to be extinguished, a flicker of defiance in the face of an overwhelming storm. This is a story about such a time when a shadow fell across the vast Pacific, Scatonis, and the world held its breath, waiting to see if that small flame of hope would survive. Our story begins not with the thunder of guns, but in the quiet, contemplative mind of a man who had unleashed the storm itself. Admiral Cato Sterling was the architect of his nation's stunning victories, brilliant strategist who saw the chessboard of the Pacific with unparalleled clarity. Yet, he was a man haunted by a ticking clock, a clock only he could hear. He had warned his leaders that while they might revel in 6 months or even a year of triumph, a protracted war against the industrial might of the West would spell certain doom. His strategy was never one of conquest, but of shock and awe. Single, devastating blow to cripple his enemy and force them to the negotiating table before their true strength could be awakened. He sought a swift peace, born from a position of unassailable strength, and for a time, his vision seemed to be reality. A crimson tide swept across the ocean, from the jungles of the Philippines to the bustling port of Hong Kong, from the rubber plantations of Malaya to the oil-rich islands of the Dutch East Indies. Fortress after fortress fell. The speed and ferocity of the advance were breathtaking, a whirlwind of coordinated power that left the old colonial empires reeling. It felt as though an entire ocean, an entire hemisphere, was being remade in a matter of weeks. The sun on their flag seemed to rise and never set on their new empire. But even in their greatest triumph, at the naval base of Pearl Harbor, a seed of doubt was planted. The primary targets, the immense American aircraft carriers, were not in port. They were out at sea, ghosts on the horizon, the unseen queens of this new war, still on the board. Then came the shock, a ghost raid. A handful of American bombers, launched from a carrier far out at sea in a move of audacious desperation, appeared over the capital itself. The material damage was negligible, but the psychological impact was a thunderclap that shook the nation to its core. The sacred homeland was no longer inviolable. The emperor himself had been endangered. For the high command, this was an intolerable humiliation. For Admiral Sterling, it was proof that the clock was ticking faster than he had feared. The quick, negotiated peace he had dreamed of was now a fantasy. The enemy's will was not broken, was hardening into cold fury. He knew then that he had no choice but to force a final, decisive confrontation. He had to lure those missing American carriers into a trap and annihilate them once and for all. This new urgency created deep fissures within the Imperial General Staff. Sterling, the naval visionary, proposed his Midway Gambit, a complex plan to seize a tiny atoll that would act as bait, forcing the American fleet into a battle where he could spring his trap. Others, in the Army-dominated command, were more cautious. They argued for the AL plan, a northern thrust to seize islands in the Alaskan chain, creating a defensive barrier and a potential bargaining chip for future negotiations. It was a clash of philosophies: Sterling's desire for a single, rending battle versus the Army's preference for a slower, more methodical expansion and consolidation. In the end, Sterling's force of will and prestige won out. But the debate had cost precious time and revealed a dangerous lack of unified strategy. While the admirals and generals debated, the forward momentum of the war machine continued. The southward advance was a steel serpent slithering down the island chains of the Pacific. They seized the strategic harbor of Rabaul, transforming it into a formidable fortress. Their bombers flew from newly captured airfields to rain destruction on the Australian port of Darwin. They landed troops on the vast, untamed island of New Guinea, beginning a brutal overland campaign to capture Port Moresby and isolate Australia from its American allies. It was here, in the turquoise waters of the Coral Sea, that the unstoppable tide first met a seawall. In the first naval battle, fought entirely by aircraft, where the opposing ships never saw one another, the advance was halted. Tactically, the battle was a draw, with both sides suffering heavy losses. But strategically, it was a landmark victory for the Allies. For the first time in 6 months, a Japanese invasion force had been turned back. The myth of invincibility was shattered. That single, stubborn flame of hope now had oxygen. On the other side of the world, Allied commanders wrestled with the immense challenge before them. The Pacific was a vast, sprawling theater, and resources were stretched thin. Debates raged over command structures and strategic priorities. The halt at the Coral Sea and the subsequent, stunning American victory at Midway, where Sterling's grand gambit ended in disaster, changed everything. The initiative, for the first time, was up for grabs. A bold, even reckless, counterattack was proposed. The target, a remote, jungle-choked island in the Solomon chain that most had never heard of Guadalcanal. Intelligence reports, initially sparse, began to paint a disturbing picture. The Japanese were building an airfield there, a dagger pointed at the vital supply lines between America and Australia. The decision was made. Under the command of the cautious and deliberate Admiral Arthur Vance, Operation Watchtower was born. It would be the first major Allied offensive of the Pacific War. The plan was fraught with peril from its inception. The timeline was brutally short, cobbled together in a matter of weeks. The troops were green, many of them barely out of basic training. Its intelligence was a patchwork of aerial photographs and vague reports from local coastwatchers. They were planning to land on an island they knew almost nothing about, against an enemy whose numbers and disposition were a mystery. The challenges mounted when the naval commander on the scene, Admiral Raymond Thorne, made a controversial but understandable decision. Tasked with protecting the precious few carriers the U.S. had left, he informed the landing force that he could only provide air cover for 2 days. After that, his fleet would have to withdraw from the dangerous, marine-infested waters, leaving the Marines on the beach exposed. It was a calculated risk, a gamble that would leave the fate of the entire operation hanging by a thread. The men on the transport ships, sailing toward the dark green shores, were sailing into the unknown, protected only by a promise with an expiration date. On the morning of August 7, 1942, the world held its breath. As the sun rose over the placid waters of the Solomon Sea, American Marines stormed the beaches of Guadalcanal. They were met with an eerie silence. The main Japanese force on the island consisted of construction battalions and labor troops who were taken completely by surprise. They fled into the dense jungle, leaving behind their construction equipment, feed-in meals, and the nearly completed airfield that was the entire objective of the operation. The main landing was anticlimactically a walkover. But just across the sound, on the smaller islands of Tulagi, Gavutu, and Tanambogo, the story was terrifyingly different. Here, the Marines ran headlong into elite Japanese naval infantry, seasoned and fanatical combat troops. The fighting was savage, a brutal, close-quarters struggle for every pillbox, cave, and trench. The defenders fought with suicidal bravery, launching hopeless charges and detonating explosives against themselves rather than surrender. It was a horrifying preview of the ferocity that would define the island campaigns to come. Guadalcanal was taken easily, but the bloody fight for Tulagi served as a stark reminder. The enemy's will to fight was absolute. In the skies above, another crucial battle was being fought. The American Wildcat fighters, rugged and heavily armed, found themselves pitted against the legendary Japanese Zero. The Zero was a marvel of aviation engineering, incredibly nimble, fast climbing, and with a longer range. In a one-on-one dogfight, it was superior. The Japanese pilots were masters of aerial combat, seasoned veterans with years of experience. The American pilots, however, learned quickly. They discovered that while their Wildcats couldn't outturn a Zero, they were tougher and could dive much faster. They abandoned individual heroics for disciplined teamwork, developing tactics where one pilot would bait a zero while his wingman dove in from above for the kill. They proved devastatingly effective against the less maneuverable Japanese bombers, but holding their own against the elite Zero squadrons was a constant, desperate struggle for survival. They were buying time, holding a fragile umbrella of air superiority over the Marines below, knowing that at any moment Admiral Thorne's carriers could disappear over the horizon. While the Americans consolidated their precarious beachhead, the Japanese reaction was swift and decisive. From his headquarters in Rabaul, Vice Admiral Kenjiro Locke was stunned by the news of the American landing. He saw it not as a major offensive, but as a minor raid, a temporary incursion that had to be crushed immediately. He gathered a scratch force of cruisers and destroyers and steamed south under the cover of darkness. Admiral Locke was a master of night combat, a skill his navy had honed to a deadly art form. They trusted their superior optics, their devastatingly effective torpedoes, and their relentless training. They knew the Americans were overconfident, reliant on radar that was still in its infancy and inexperienced in the chaos of a naval battle fought in pitch blackness. As Locke's 8th Fleet sliced through the dark waters toward Guadalcanal, they were an unseen specter of vengeance. Allied intelligence, blinded by a series of miscommunications and a fatal underestimation of their enemy, had failed to detect their approach. The American and Australian warships guarding the transports sat at anchor, their crews at a low state of alert, utterly oblivious to the steel wolfpack closing in for the kill. And so, the stage was set. On a remote island of jungle and swamp, a few thousand Marines clung to a tiny perimeter. Centered on a dirt runway they had already christened Henderson Field, they were alone, their naval support about to be withdrawn, their aerial lifeline tenuous at best. In the skies, young pilots were learning on the job, fighting for their lives with every sortie. And steaming towards them through the darkness was a powerful enemy fleet, ready to deliver a blow that could not only shatter the invasion, but change the course of the entire war. The initial victories had been won. The first steps of the long road back had been taken. But the true test, the true crucible of fire, was only just beginning. It was here, in the darkness of Iron Baton Sound and the malarial jungles of Guadalcanal, that the single, stubborn flame of the human spirit will be tested as never before, proving that it is not the strength of the storm that matters most, but the will of those who refuse to let their light be extinguished.